Welcome. I've been expecting you. Settle in. Take the load off. If not a physical one, at least a mental one. I can wait. We have time. Though this won't always hold nearly so true for you. You know, there comes a point in every Dark Lord's life in which they've got to face hard truths about themselves. Do I look good in jewelry? Have I really been doing as much as I can to spread darkness all throughout the universe? Do I actually like deviled eggs? Or am I just a fan of the name? That sort of thing. And so, after thinking about it long and hard, it's with a heavy heart that I must finally be honest about something. I'm not really a fan of the color turquoise. I'm sorry, I'm just not. I know this probably comes as a shock to all of you, and so if any of you need time to pause and compose yourselves, I completely understand. But I'm afraid there's nothing any of you can say or do to get me to change my mind here or go back on this. I don't like turquoise. There, I said it a second time. Does that help make it any easier to swallow? I think in my heart of hearts I've always known. I mean, I tried to convince myself I liked it for years, and when put on the spot would always be quick to grandstand about it or whatever. But looking back, I suspect that has more to do with my own baggage than anything else. Plus, wanting to avoid all the family drama and social repercussions which could have resulted had I ever been so public about this kind of thing up until a few years ago. You know how it is. Look, I love being banished for eternity in the Shadow Realm as much as the next whatever I am. But even I have to admit, there are some things about the general culture which I'm not super keen on. It's like you let slip to one being you know down here that you don't like turquoise, and the next thing you know, they're slipping poison into your vents. I don't know, perhaps I'm being a little inconsiderate right now, but I don't always feel that the reaction is proportionate. That, and I'm not so keen on how quick the justice system over here is to melt people's faces off. Anywho, that's enough about all that for today. Sorry to get so political on you. I'm your heinous host, Mr. Dork, and you're watching Season 2 of my glorious and gangrene endeavor. Are You Afraid of the Dork? Episode 7. Ominous Ink. What manner of malarkey might you be in for today? I guess you'll just have to listen on and find out. Because to be blunt, there's not much of a visual. Sit down the bear and straddle the bull, because it's time for yet another ride on Mr. Dork's Dork Express of Darkness or something.
Ominous ink. I've got a bad feeling about this. Look out behind you. Don't look down. We're only making it stronger. How could things possibly get any worse? Bob Doman sighed and pressed another pillow into his head, hoping to compensate for his creative slump by maybe coming that much closer to accidentally suffocating himself instead. His next bye-bye quarterly review was coming up, and as of late he had been churning out nothing but cliches. Bob worked for Ominous Inc., the head company responsible for developing and marketing ominous products, services, and slogans for general use and distribution all over the world. It was a peculiar company, which everyone there took some amount of pride in, but unfortunately it was in large part able to remain that way, thanks to the uniquely brutal work pressures it imposed upon its still living employees. You see, all who worked for Ominous were expected to be kept under a constant state of stress so as to better enable them to remain in a headspace where they could develop and market the utmost maximally ominous goods and services imaginable. Naturally, not every employee was the same, and so there existed many different programs which could be mixed and matched so as to ensure every employee remained as anxious and prone to flights of violent bloody terror as possible. For Bob, this largely entailed sporadic mandatory response company notices, which could pop up on his phone between the hours of 10 p.m. to 8 in the morning. Although every so often they'd throw one or two well outside the range, or even while he was still at work, just to keep him on his toes. That and the quarterly reviews, which assessed his performance 16 times a year based upon his latest metrics. An unsatisfactory score in a mere 2 categories was grounds for immediate termination and being catapulted out a 15-story window. But rumor had it such a fate was only reserved for those employees who had a confirmed fear of heights, which Bob mercifully did not have, although it did raise questions about what specifically would become of him if, God forbid, his time to leave ever came. Needless to say, it wasn't looking good. The advent of AI was now, and Bob was in the slogan department. As before, he'd been expected to crank out maybe 100 sleek and professional quality, ominous-sounding sentences and slogans a day. Now, with AI on the scene, his workload had increased 5-fold and rising. Bob was lucky in the sense that he was just a grunt, not subjected to nearly the same pressures or threats to life and limb that those even 1 or 2 positions above him were. But he had nonetheless been feeling the crunch recently, and knew full well that his metrics would not be looking so hot going into his bye-bye quarterly review tomorrow. Ominous Inc. took pride in its craft and co-workers, and as such, 16 times a year, existing employees were expected to re-interview for their own position to justify their continued employment/sometimes existence. The higher up you went in the company, the more hellish and likely lethal of a process this became. But for grunts like Bob, he more than halfway expected he'd be able to get away with just a mere few broken bones and immediate termination, unless he had been afraid of heights, in which case it would have been the catapult for him. Lesser grunts would have quit. Those lesser still might have even taken one of the company-branded bowls littered throughout the first-floor lobby and gone home. But Bob loved his workplace. He loved his co-workers. Josiah, Kendra, Josiah, Pelver, Helga, Olma, Josiah. They were a small team, working in a small subsection of a forgettable and, in the grand scheme of things, unimportant corner of a floor towards the base of the main company building. But they had a good rapport, and they worked well together, And I've managed to produce some truly top-shelf content over the years, in between surviving the various employee-eating monsters, supernatural occurrences, and company functions they were sporadically subjected to. He was in no mood to sleep, but annoyingly, no mood to get anything done either. All I could really do was just exist until morning and do his best to come to grips with all the tension swirling around inside him. It was funny. Ominous Inc., it had great bonuses. Excellent dental, excellent medical, generous paid vacation and paternity leave. For a company whose stated mission was to make the world a more ominous place, they were surprisingly generous when it came to offering benefits. But then again, sooner or later the job would eventually kill you. Didn't matter who you were. That was just the ominous way of things. Whether from an ulcer or a heart attack or a tentacled abomination picking people off one at a time as it slinked and squelched from room to the vents, or a horrible new breed of face-eating spider. Everyone had to die sometime, and grunts like Bob, who didn't even have access to firearms or explosive gels or even any of the cyanide pills or full floor access, well, they tended to die off fastest of all. Growing up, Bob had a friend who was watching this old sci-fi movie with him. It was a forgettable creature feature involving a lab and, like an experimental bioweapon which eventually broke free and went on a schlocky budget movie rampage. The friend's name was no longer important on account of Bob having fallen out of touch with them so long ago, but the question lingered. Who the hell would even work for a place like that in the first place? It seemed a valid point. Many of the scientists depicted in the movie they were watching seemed to be needlessly risking life and limb for no obvious gain. And it was easy enough to critique them for their life choices as some monster was just as effortlessly tearing through their workplaces as their flesh. Its only quality approaching restraint being whenever it died to stop and gleefully rip out their intestines one by one. But the question also kind of offended Bob at the moment his friend asked it, because it was a question Bob already knew the answer to. Who the hell would work there? Well, his dad did. His dad chose that kind of work. His father, his father's father, and eventually he himself, it was in their blood. It was what gave them each the most satisfaction in their lives. The most long-standing and consistent sense of purpose and stability. Ominous Inc. and companies like it weren't just a job, but an entire way of life. Sure, they seemed easy to critique, but his dad's life insurance, that had put him through college. His siblings, too. For working-class Americans, there just weren't reliable ways to comfortably make ends meet anymore, save for places like Ominous Inc. They might have dabbled with satanic rites, mucked about with barrels of nuclear waste, accidentally unleashed all manner of new predators and diseases upon their employees every single year they were in business. and just generally done a very poor job of maintaining a safe working environment. But they also employed some of the kindest and most interesting people you'd ever meet. And so, needless to say, from the moment his comment was uttered, Bob's friend quickly became his ex-friend. Now, 18 years later, and one of the leading reasons Bob was so worried for his evaluation the following day, it wasn't out of any sort of fear of what might be done to him. Not really, not truly. But rather, it was primarily derived from the fear he might ever be forced to leave the company. Ominous ink. It wasn't even just a way of life. It was also a second family. Huddling together with your co-workers under desk, hand over mouth, silently praying to each other, just your eyes that will not be found, squeezing what remains out of one of your mate's limp hand hard enough to the point where you're actually beginning to cut off the circulation of what, until moments before, had just been bleeding out all over the carpet. Getting to know each of your coworkers well enough to the point where you'd know what freaky new alien periodic table elements they're allergic to, and what survival skills they brought to the table in the disturbingly plausible event of some kind of fresh hell erupting from the break room fridge. To some, these might have sounded like a compilation of profoundly traumatic experiences which no human being should have ever been subjected to. But they were, and they did happen to him and his coworkers all the time. And Bob's eyes, the survivors were always all the better for it. There was a kind of perverse sentimentality which came about from it all. The kind of sentimentality which could only really come about between people in trenches, all desperately struggling to somehow do their duties and carry on no matter what the world threw at them, or some emotional equivalent thereof. It was always such a mild thrill, walking into work each shift and not being able to know for certain which of your co-workers had lived or died. Bob tried not to take any of it too personally, and he usually succeeded at this too. Bob was a mook. All the co-workers he most regularly interacted with were. It was simply a fact of life. They were the fodder. They were from a class expected to make up the majority of the casualty list whenever things went wrong. And with the company literally named Ominous Inc., they often did. The funny thing was, all considered, Bob's core team of 8 had been pretty fortunate, all having managed to remain consistently employed, alive, and around the same level of standing in the company for over 5 years. It was a rare feat, to be certain, at the level which they were operating, but Bob held on to his views on death and his class's place in the world through it all, even as he couldn't quite help but, against his professional instincts, make small talk with Josiah, Kendra, Holma, Pelver, Helga, and all the others every once in a while. There were some who went about things all wrong. Mooks who, despite having started at the company not even very long ago, and truly most often being little more than interns and coffee jockeys, still believed they were owed some kind of special treatment or explanation whenever something dramatic happened which was outside their control. Things like having coworkers going into rooms and never coming back out, or permanently losing track of friends or family in the building. Things like that, which definitely weren't even major deals by company standards, and could probably more accurately be described as min to moderate inconveniences. As a rule of thumb, no one really liked those negative Nancys, those complaining Kevins. But there had actually been one time in particular, and it stuck with Bob. It involved his own team, back before it had managed to stabilize itself, and was operating true to the spirit of how the job usually went for those on his level. The incident involved a freshly married couple, both women, and ones who were very sweet together at that, harboring a kind of dynamic in which both of their contrasting personalities played off of each other really well, and in general, their presence did marvels to liven up the, at times, truthfully dull and bureaucratic happenings of being a muck for a self-admittedly shady old mega company. Well, their love was as sweet as it was true, and though one of them would turn out to be short-lived for the line of work, she seemed to still have a knack for being both good at her job and terribly endearing, seemingly without even meaning to. Even some of those in management, who very openly didn't like most anyone, and projected nothing but coldness and disdain at all the mooks and lessers they passed by on the way to the elevators, commentated positively upon her occasionally. Seemed like she could have really went places if she'd only had a few more years. Unfortunate it was then those parasites managed to infect her through that suspicious company-promoted energy drink at all, eating her brain, turning her skin inside out, as that particular breed was most inclined to do 2 weeks after being ingested. Rebel's loss was truly unfortunate. Even Bob was affected somewhat. Actually put a damper on his work ethic for a solid week there. But perhaps it was no surprise that Willow, her partner, was affected most of all. The people who ran Ominous were not idiots. They knew that the death of a loved one, friend, or partner was not something your average person who was not yet acclimated to the company culture would take lying down. For most, this matter was almost entirely addressed through their exceptional pay and workplace benefits. Even mooks like Bob or Willow were paid more than triple what your average American family made in 1960 when adjusted for inflation, and they were towards the bottom rung, occupying positions low enough that many modern companies would balk at the suggestion of paying them a living wage. And of course, there was the entire incentive structure for promotions, a central tenet of which emphasized minimizing connections with potential friends and family members. Crying over spilled milk and dead partners might have been fine for people like Willow, but Bob, for the life of him, just couldn't figure out why any sane person would jeopardize their chance to go from being merely upper class to astronomically rich. The final disincentive against what a warpath Willow ultimately decided to go on was in the very name of the company. It was called ominous for a reason. If you raise too much of a stink about its organization, practices, or management techniques too frequently, it was not out of the realm of possibility for the company to simply disappear you. Lord knows they had every means available to them at their disposal, should they be so inclined to do so. Compensation packages were always generous, even for mooks, being calculated as being the current estimated value of human life plus 50%, and whatever other multipliers factored in depending upon if your rank was any higher in the company. And 6 months paid vacation. This wasn't just fair. Relative to most every other company in all the world, aside from a few of Ominous's direct competitors, this was astoundingly generous. Astoundingly fair when it came to accounting for the financial impact of losing a partner, the value of their life, and the grieving process necessary to get over them. And yet, curiously, Willow persisted like no one Bob had seen before or since. She persisted despite having every disincentive not to. Persisted despite the fact that the person she was allegedly agitating on behalf of was incapable of appreciating her efforts. Was he missing something? Was she perhaps operating under some kind of psychosis? Why, she must have been, because inexplicably, 3 months after a conscientious objection to her compensation, after petty displays of workplace rebellion, her rabble-rousing, and her most unprofessional displays of on-the-clock anger and grief, Willow was promoted. Or she would have been, had she the good sense to get along while the going was good. Then, to his utter astonishment, they upped her compensation offer, and she declined anyways, on behalf of some half-remembered camaraderie for what was now a stinking corpse. Ridiculous didn't even begin to describe the display. Certainly was not much of a proponent of the ominous family way, that Willow. As far as he was concerned, her employment had been a stain on the company's otherwise decent track record of hiring nice, discreet people. People like him. People that recognized the significance of all that was given to them and appreciated it all the more for it. People who would kill for the company. People that probably could have and should have been promoted in that lousy rabble-rouser's stead. And she still declined them after they basically offered her the world over nothing? Obnoxious. Obnoxious. It was all so terribly obnoxious. But why was he thinking about this now? Wasting that much more mental energy on that ingrate from years ago, who was offered every opportunity to play along, but instead finally and entirely preventably got herself killed after threatening to go public. He was tired, too tired to even sleep, or maybe it was just anxiety. In any case, he could feel himself growing more anxious and more rattled all the time. His thoughts were starting to become more erratic, their underlying tone more agitated. But it broke his heart to think that tomorrow might be his last day at Ominous Inc. To think of all that might befall him, of losing his nice job, of missing out on his chance to so readily encounter interesting people and circumstances in the world, of losing his connections with his co-workers, of having his memories wiped after sticking it out for so many years, of becoming ignorant again, like just another commoner, of forever losing out on his chance to more deeply ingratiate himself within the company, of having to settle for a job which would in all likelihood have nothing to do with his family's line of work. Bob was so lost in thought that he almost forgot to respond to the latest blaring company alarm. The noise of it all was one of those things which one could grow surprisingly accustomed to sleeping through, if they weren't too careful. Kind of like those who lived right by train tracks. But Bob still had the presence of mind to not allow himself to be so distracted as to all but guarantee his firing prior to the big evaluation tomorrow. Blurry-eyed and wrought with nerves, Bob probably wouldn't be sleeping any time soon. But he'd survive it ominous. He'd go on to continue his position there for at least another 3/4 of a month. Those stupid chatbots might have been in the process of increasing his workload fivefold and then some, but he was Bob Doman, a name that did not inspire confidence, but instead something better. The image of a loyal company dog, able and willing to do whatever it took to remain in his master's good graces. He was going to do it, because Bob was a mook, damn it. That was something which had been in his blood for generations. His father had been one. His grandfather had been one. Even his great-great-grandmother had been one. No, he wouldn't be sleeping tonight. That much was clear. But in lieu of sleep, Bob would commit himself to something better. Service and furtherance to his company's global mission. His work portfolio was looking rough. His numbers had been slipping for the past quarter of a year. But Bob had survived vampire attacks. He had fought off man-eating toilets, hyper-evolving mold, and all manner of other horrors and oddities unleashed upon himself and all his co-workers for years now. He was such a reliable presence at the office, and he practically wasn't even a mook anymore, but an honest-to-God recurring character. And so, in the face of his own looming redundancy, Bob was not going to be a willow of the world, selfishly swatting away opportunities as life doled them out. But he was going to live his life as a full-throated Bob Doman, making full use of what 4.5 hours he had left, rewriting his portfolio, and making a well-documented case for himself, until it became clear to Arnis's rehiring board just what a valuable asset he could be. And so, with thrice renewed vigor and a fourfold increase in confidence, Bob Tiley swaggered into work the following day, went through the shifting maze of cubicles, up the 500-foot main floor escalator, down the series of dark and ominous corridors, into the poison ivy-riddled hedge maze, between the two ominous pillars, which looked like they were going to slam themselves together at any moment. Around the ominous-looking statue, with all the warning signs around its base. And finally, from beginning to end of the old rotting bridge right before the door to the company evaluation offices. The whole experience was designed to be akin to an ever-mounting roller coaster, not so much in terms of height, but in terms of tension. Build up and release. Build up and release. Finally, the beginning of the end. A half-reassuring sight. An ominous passage leading to an ominous pair of doors fitting for such an ominous encounter and such an ominous company. The only thing that was missing was an indoor artificial lightning strike here and there, and maybe the occasional bottomless pit. Incidentally, two phenomena that the higher-ups had been rather adamant about developing for years. With one final breath, Bob stepped inside, knowing full well the air would only be getting thinner with time and the moment the doors closed behind him in the room to come. Time was a valuable commodity, and the powers that be had decided 3 years before that mooks like Bob only really needed 10 minutes worth of oxygen to make their case regarding whether they were still fit to be employed at the company for the next 1/16th of a year. Had his efforts been enough? Would Bob be able to do it? To successfully make his case for himself? Was he still worthy enough to work for Ominous? To find the answer to all these questions and more, tune in next.
Pathetic worms! I have finally risen. Now feel the embrace of my eternal torment nexus.
Clear and present screaming can now be heard in the background. Somewhere, on the very floor Bob is now on for his re-interview, a cinematically filmed horse is majestically prancing about, equal parts in pain as it is on fire. To be continued, never. The end.
Love me a cliffhanger. But you know what I like better? An honest-to-God cliff. What? After all that build-up, you wanted a resolution? You wanted more. Well, guess what? Sometimes life doesn't give you those things. Sometimes stories end before much of anything in it can get meaningfully resolved. Yes, quake in horror at my superior powers of darkness. Tremble before my annoying and narratively atrocious avant-garde style of storytelling. Shake your appendage of choice at the sky at my reminder that for many of you, meaningful closure in most respects, whether it be romantic, familiar, workplace-related, etc., will never come. And that endings can come at any time, even when one least expects them. And most importantly, make sure to always try to cherish what time and moments you have with the animals who love you in your life. In a world in which no one is guaranteed tomorrow, perhaps it's wise to act the part. I'd like to thank each and every one of you, my spooky children, for tuning in today. Be seeing you real soon. This has been your heinous host, Mr. Dork, and I'm signing off, baby.